talk about Polybase in Hadoop, which is one of the features I think is really cool that Microsoft has added into 2016, which is coming out, I don't know, because they're not telling, but I will say that release candidate 0 just came out on Friday, so getting closer. I'm guessing sometime end of April, but that's just a guess. So create your own pool since you're probably not doing really good in the NC2A brackets. So anyway, SQL Server and big data. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to do a little overview of SQL Server 2016, give you kind of a little highlight reel, and talk about how Hadoop stores data and what SQL-like tools can you play with Hadoop. So Hadoop's not necessarily a strange foreign thing, and then a little bit about the history of Polybase. Newsflash, Polybase is not null. And then talking about what you need to implement Polybase in SQL Server 2016 and some of the limitations of Polybase. Like every tool, it doesn't do everything, so I wanted to let you know when is a good time to use it and when probably not the best. A little bit about me. I tweet way too often at Desert Isle SQL and blog quite a bit at desertisleSQL.com. And I am a BI consultant here at Pragmatic Works, and that's my email if you want to get a hold of me later. But to be honest, you're better off trying to reach me on Twitter. All right. So a little bit of the highlight reel for SQL Server. There's a lot that SQL Server has done. First thing that I want to mention, another thing that I like playing with is R. For those of you who think I'm just talking pirate, R. I'm not. R is a language of data scientists, and so if you want to know more about R, my latest blog post was on it, so it gives you an idea of something starting to do with it. Microsoft bought a company called Revolution Analytics last year, and they're incorporating R features into SQL Server, which is not something that is very unique. As a matter of fact, Oracle and Oracle and IBM are also incorporating R with their databases too. The other item that's really kind of neat that's new to 26 is JSON. It's natively supported, so now you can query it. Since you see a lot of JSON and web services, it's something that's now available natively in 2016. Stretch database. This is a really neat feature and allows you to put part of your database in the cloud. So if you want to archive things off, you can archive them off to the cloud, or basically your database has got no limits anymore, which is kind of great if all of a sudden you're out of space. SSRS. SSRS was the poor, lonely, ignored application in the whole BI stack, but Microsoft has decided to stick a lot of resources on it. They bought a company named DataZen, which was a mobile application for reporting, and they are incorporating that into SSRS. So SSRS is going to be able to natively deploy your reports to your phone, just like Power BI, but unlike Power BI, this is a solution that is totally based on premises. So people who don't like cloud really kind of like this offering. There's a lot of new visualizations in SSRS and making it more like Power BI. By the way, for those people who are interested in Power BI, Microsoft has promised that they will start working on an on-premises version of Power BI after 2016 rolls out. So if you want to do Power BI functionality, but there's no way where you work they're doing anything cloudish, that's going to happen later on when Microsoft gets around to finishing that up. Okay, SSIS. So SSIS got Power Query. For anybody who's ever played with Power Query, the kinds of analysis and fixing up data really quickly is really a neat feature. And I remember when I was doing, I was thinking, shoot, I wish I could do this in SSIS. It would make cleaning up bad text files a lot faster. Well, great, they put that functionality right in there. SSAS Tabular. Now it has got many-to-many. This is a really big feature for SSAS analysis services. I know that there are times that I really wanted to do analysis services tabular because I think it's much easier to deploy and maintain over time, but I couldn't do it because it didn't support many-to-many. Well, now I can. Of course, it still doesn't have role-playing dimensions, but you know, hey, better luck next time. Query Store. For those of you who don't know what that is, Query Store is a really neat application which allows you to take advantage of your previous executions. So it's the query store is a repository of your previous execution plans and runtime stats. So if you can force the query to use a execution plan that you used in the past, which may not be the one you presently used. So it's a really great performance tweaking tool. I know that I've run into improper execution plans being used in stored procs. If you do reindex, it just generates one. But you can actually go to the query store and have it load up a new one, which is kind of a really neat thing. And once again, Microsoft went and have a new version of SQL Server data tools. Frankly, I think I like the ones in 2012 better because I really don't like the monochrome, boring color. But it's not that whole lot different looking. But it's right now, though, you cannot run it in Windows 7. So if you still have Windows 7, you are going to need to upgrade, or you're not going to be running SQL Server data tools. And I think that's going to be a big deal because I know a lot of people who haven't upgraded. So although this isn't really vaporware, I figured I'd put the Vapor Bowl out there since it's not out yet. But this functionality, I've had a chance to play around with it. It's all out there. Anybody who wants to go ahead and download the release candidate 1, which is the current release, can. It's free, and I've not known it to crash anybody's machine that I know of, so it's pretty safe to do. So now on to what we really wanted to talk about today, and that's Polybase. So Microsoft is bringing Hadoop to SQL Server, as this has gotten to be a really big deal in the marketplace. A lot of people have data stored in data lakes or in HDFS clusters somewhere, and they want to be able to combine that data with SQL Server. And with SQL Server 2016, Microsoft is incorporating some technology that they originally had in the APS that's now available in 2016. And I remember when it was first available in APS because I thought that was a really neat way of being able to query not only the data in SQL Server, but marrying it with data that was archived in HDFS. And now we can because it's now coming to SQL Server. So what is Polybase? Well, first we'll get into what you need it for. Well, what's Hadoop? Well, Hadoop is just a distributed file system. So instead of storing your data in a database, you store it in a duplicated file system. And the reason it's duplicated is back in the day when Google created it, believe it or not, they had no money, and they stored they were using Oracle, and their servers were crashing all the time. And they couldn't afford the licenses to keep updates with Oracle, and they couldn't they're having problems indexing everything every night anyway. So when they developed Hadoop, what they did is they duplicated the data on multiple servers for a number of reasons. One of them is they bought old cheap servers and they crashed a lot. And the other one is so that they could geographically distribute them around the world so that they could index in multiple places. So Hadoop, generally speaking, writes data to multiple servers. I got asked this question recently, and you do not have to write data to multiple servers, and I bring that up because if you want to play with it and you only want to write it once, it still works. It's just not, it's designed to be fault tolerant, and you're just eliminating the fault tolerance if you're doing that. But hey, if you're just learning, that doesn't really matter. So the Hadoop Collective is more than just the file system. Everyone talks about Hadoop, but it's really a number of different components. I've not listed them all here because my slide would have to have such tiny writing that you couldn't read any of it. So the main portion of it here, though, is HDFS, which is the underlying file system. Back in the day, everyone thought that you had to go write MapReduce code, and actually I still run into people who think that too. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to get data out of HDFS. I need to go write a Java program. No, that's not true. There's a number of ways that you can get data out of HDFS. The more common ones are there on using Hive, Pig, and Who. Which is the user interface to allow you to get at the data. Sqoop is actually the first iteration of the ability to combine data from HDFS to a relational database. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Spark, you probably have heard quite a bit about recently, since that is the streaming portion of Hadoop, and it's getting a lot of press. People are using it for IoT events. Cassandra and Impala and HBase are actual databases that are built on top of HDFS, Impala was created by Doug Cutting. Doug Cutting actually created Hadoop. I didn't, the actual little Hadoop toy on the previous slide was his son's, and that's where the name came from. He was at Yahoo when he read about Google's paper and created an open source version of the Google file system, which he called Hadoop after his son's toy. He went to Yahoo and then left there, and he now works for Cloudera, and they created the Impala database, which is a relational database sitting on top of the HDFS cluster. So it uses it uses the HDFS file system, but it looks and performs quite a lot like a database. Cassandra is a token ring database. One of its big users is Netflix, and they store their data on there. HBase was created for very large data stores. Facebook uses it. If you don't have, you know, a petabyte, don't even bother with HBase because it's designed to store and retrieve really big bits of data. So that's just some of the portions of Hadoop because it does contain a lot of it, and we're actually only going to be talking about accessing data from the HDFS cluster with Polybase. All right, but so there's other ways you can access data, which is kind of what Polybase builds upon, is Pig, and Pig writes a schema over the top of it. Both of Pig and Hive are SQL-like, and I'm going to give you show you a little example of how SQL-like they are, so you can see how close they are. I talked a little bit about the Impala database, but I will say it's fast. I have played around with it. It's free if you can, and it uses standard ANSI SQL. Sqoop was the original method for putting data in and querying data from HDFS and on a relational database. And how it works is it copies the data from an HDFS file cluster into your relational database. Well, that's great, but how many of you know exactly the file size of the data that you happen to have stored somewhere? Well, I can tell you I didn't, because when I was playing around with Sqoop and putting data into SQL Server, I crashed it because I put too much data into my database, and it is completely, you know, unforgiving, and you'll just keep on copying data until your database blows up, which is exactly what happened to me. It is supported though, so if people say, hey, you know, you don't need to use Polybase, you could always get data from Hadoop. Well, that's true, but there are some limitations with it, and it's actually physically copies the data over, which isn't natively querying the HDFS cluster. It's basically copying it into your relational database. So a little bit about Pig, though. Pig looks more like a combination of SQL and ETL. Here I've shown a simple SQL select statement, and this is the equivalent Pig code to do the same thing. Now I'm assuming most people are familiar with SQL Server, and you can kind of look at this and see how this relates to the query over here on the left. First, you need to load the data. You give it a schema. You load the other table. You give it a schema. You tell it what you want to filter on. You tell it what you want to join on. And you sum things. You put a filter on it, and then you dump it out. So you can read Pig, and that's one way of getting data out of HDFS. Hive is the more popular way because it looks just like SQL. It runs on ANSI SQL, so if you're familiar with it, you can write Hive. One of the things that you have to do with Hive is you have to create a schema on top of it. One thing to remember about having a data lake or a Hadoop cluster is you have to know what your underlying data structure is in order to be able to use any of these tools. Because if you are going to create a table on top of it, it's got to be organized in a way that you can do that. And you need to know how it's organized so that you can be able to provide that schema that you can later on query. But once you've got the schema created, you can go ahead and use Hive. All right, so what Sqoop does is it creates the ability to transfer data in and out, and it imports the data from HDFS. But like I said, that can be a scalability issue because you will be inserting all of your data into SQL Server. You're not using the data into the file system at all at that point. But Polybase is Microsoft's implementation. What Microsoft has done is they're combining SQL Server and Hadoop. You are not copying data with Polybase. You are natively querying the data as it sits on HDFS. You're not moving it, which means you never will blow up your database. So it originated in the 2010 in the PW appliance. And so it's something that Microsoft has been working on for a while, and they just figured out how to put it on SQL Server. So I will go ahead and show you how to do that because it's kind of a pretty neat tool. One method that I've heard a lot of people talking about is this way you can keep your data. Let's say that you want it around just in case there's some kind of a legal reason, you know, a lawyer sends you a demand letter or something, says come up with all the data. You don't necessarily need to store all that in a database because frankly most of the time you don't need to. But when you do, you can just access it with SQL Server and query it as if it was part of your database. Now I will say it's not part of your database, so that does mean that it is slower. There's no indexing on files per se, so you lose some speed when you are querying data from HDFS. All right, so a little bit of history of Polybase. I like to throw this up there because it just kind of shows how Microsoft's philosophy on data has changed over time. So in 2009, we're not doing Polybase. 3 years later, we're doing it. So that's kind of how Microsoft has been brought into Hadoop, and they're fully involved in it now. As a matter of fact, Microsoft is even contributing to some of the products in the Apache Collective. They've done quite a bit of work with Org, so they are fully engaged in all things Hadoop. So it was, like I said, it was originally added to the Parallel Data Warehouse, officially the version in 2012. You can query both HDFS and straight SQL in the same query, so you can join to the tables. And it was released in SQL Server 2016 CTP, and I believe it was CTP 2. But since we're past that now, it doesn't really matter. Any version that you would download now will have the ability to do Polybase. So what do you have to do to make Polybase work? Well, there are some steps. So what you want to do, the first step you have to do is you have to know that you want to do it because you are going to need to install, select installation functions for Polybase. You have to pick it off the list. What that does is it installs 2 servers. You know what's weird too? When I first did this, I noticed that the Polybase data movement wasn't always running. So after you do the install, you might want to check this to make sure that they're both running because I have had it not. And these are the 2, if you do choose not to install Polybase as an option on the install, these 2 servers will not exist. So if you think about doing it later, yes, you will have to put the disk back in and do it because these services will not be loaded on your machine otherwise. All right. So once you get that, you'll see some new objects in Management Studio, which is kind of the only way that you know that you did something. I'll show you it in a minute, but I kind of wanted to show you a picture so you can see where it is. So underneath tables, you'll have this folder called external tables. So these external tables are tables that actually live in HDFS. And notice it puts the default schema on them. And your external resources and data sources will show you that as well. And this is where the data, the references to your HDFS file structures are. Okay. All right, so once you've got it installed, yes, there's more steps that you have to do. You have to run the sp configure command and pick Hadoop connectivity and 5. So what are your options? Well, if you do 0, if your Hadoop connectivity is 0, you've effectively turned it off. If you turn it, if you set the flag tier to 3, then you enable it for Cloudera for Linux. 4 is enable platform for Hortonworks on the Windows server. And 5 is for the Hortonworks data platform on Linux. I'm using the Hortonworks sandbox for Linux. If you want to get started, I recommend doing it that way. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, because I know a lot of people have said, well, I'm not going to do a VM because it's going to cost me money. No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to cost you a dime because Oracle has a virtual box that you can use for installing and running, and it's open source so that you don't need to have to go buy VMware, which is a great product, but I understand, hey, not wanting to shell out any money, and you don't have to. You can always use the free stuff. It will work just fine. The Hortonworks client is also free, so you can get started playing with Polybase, and it's not going to cost you a dime because since the software isn't released, Microsoft is not charging right now for SQL Server 2016 as well. So if you want to start playing around with this, cost is not a barrier until it gets released. All right, so once you've got that configured, the next thing that you're going to probably want to do is you're going to want to modify the configuration files. And the reason why you're probably going to want to modify the configuration files is they're set to PW user, the value here. And that's not generally what you want. The default is Hue, which is the UI for Hortonworks, and this is default set to PW user, which is going to be wrong. So when you're going to modify that to grant the access, and then of course you will need to restart SQL, the services, because it will not recognize that you did all that until you restart. After that, wait, more steps. So once it's been configured, then you can actually have the ability of telling SQL Server how to connect to it. Again, this is the information for the Hortonworks sandbox. So I'm creating my external data source, so I'm basically telling it the location of my HDFS cluster, and I'm telling it it's of type Hadoop, and I'm telling it where it is, which is HDFS sandbox Hortonworks. So that's where that is. And the next thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to want to tell it what my data looks like. So the data is stored in an external file. For those of you who are unfamiliar with TSV, it's the latest and greatest file format. It means tab separated values. So it's now people, you see that more than CSV, although personally I prefer CSV. Don't think you have to do funny quotes like this. The funny quotes like this are only because this is how it showed up in this font. They're really just straight single quotes. And I'm telling it also what the date format looks like. Now I just do the date format because I always do the date format. It doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily required in the data set that I've got. So let's actually take a look at the data set that I've got. So here's the data set. I've loaded this up into Hortonworks, but it's just in this case, this one's a comment delimited file. So I've got truck ID, I've got driver ID, I've got event, I've got lat, long, city, state, velocity, event indicator, and island indicator. So this is what the data looks like when I'm looking at it in Excel, but I will also I have it in Excel, but I've loaded it up into my Hadoop cluster. Let me show you how I did that. So what I did is I got the Oracle VirtualBox Manager here, and I downloaded the Hortonworks sandbox, which is running, and when it's running, I have the ability to load it up in Mbari. So this is my Mbari sandbox here. So this is everything that comes with downloaded from your from Hortonworks. There's some demo for the automatic. Oops. These are some other tools that you can use. The reason that I actually have data, and this is kind of like DOS, if you just go back and click on the dots, you'll get back to your root. So I loaded my data into temp because basically I wanted to play around with it and show how that I could do it. So I loaded my data into my geolocation file here. And this is why I'm telling you that I know exactly what it looks like, because I basically loaded that file that I showed you in Excel, and I loaded it up here just as an exercise so that I could show you how to do it. And if you don't feel like loading data, you can go to the samples which are available within the sandbox. Come on, ninja clicking, which are here. And the importance of physically where that they're located, the reason that that matters is because you are going to need to reference where they're located within HDFS. So the fact that it's demo data customer, or in my case, that it is here in temp data, and this is where it is, I'm going to need to know that because I'm going to reference that in what I'm writing in SQL Server so I can tell it where it is. So again, this isn't terribly difficult to do, and like I said, it's not going to run you a dime, so there's no financial reason not to do it. Okay, so now that I'm this far, what I'm going to do is actually show you the way the code looks in SQL Server. So right. So I know I reviewed these steps in the slides, but I wanted to show you exactly how they're running. And so the demo gods are smiling on me. I want to make sure that I have it typed out already. So if you look here, you'll see that I've just gotten really boring and I loaded up AdventureWorks and AdventureWorks Data Warehouse here. And I have a test database because I created one of those. I showed you this earlier on the slide. So this is my external table, and this is where the table that I loaded is. Here's my external data source here. I loaded 2 file formats because I was playing around with this. So I've got both CSV and TSV. So the first step I have to do here is my Hadoop connectivity. So it's telling me that that I have to make sure that I put the configure step in here. And then the next thing that I need to do is I need to modify the file for the Hadoop configuration file. So this is a configuration file. You'll notice that it's generally located in wherever you happen to have SQL Server loaded. So program files, Microsoft SQL Server, 2016 is version 13, and my instance is called SQL Server 2016. And it's in bin, Polybase settings, and Hadoop config. This is where the file is located. If you've got, whatever your instance name, is what's going to show up here. And what you need to change is I needed to change this value right here. This was set to PDW instead of Hugh, and if it's set to the wrong username, it's not going to work. So that's what the next step would be. And then after that, what I needed to do was go and restart my services. So here's the services. You'll notice that here's the Polybase engine, the Polybase data movement, and then, of course, SQL Server 2016. Now, if you're restarting, of course, it makes sense to do it from here because it also stops Polybase. So after you run the configuration statement, you will need to do this. And you'll notice that it turned all 3 of these off. Let's see if it turns them all back on. Didn't. Oh, well. It's not going to kill me to click. But double check because one time it did. So one time it actually did the engine, not the data movement. So it's going and restarting, and then I need to restart. I'm going to start this as well. Oh, nice. Okay, so now I've got everything back running. Okay. All right, so once I've got it back running, then I can go and tell it what my format is, and I did CSV because I have a CSV file, which is what I showed you. My field terminator is a comma, and that's my date format. So the next thing I needed to do here, was I needed to create my table. The table's not going to exist unless I tell it what it's in it. And of course, if you give it the wrong size, which I did, it'll blow up on you. So you need to make sure that you do it here. And I was playing around with it and noticed it worked with TSV, which I think is kind of funny, but TSV, CSV, they both seem to work. So either way, I also loaded a sample. Sorry about that. And then after that, whoops, I was able to just load up the data. So this is coming straight from my HDFS file cluster. So I'm just able to query it as if it was a table, and I could then join on it with other information that existed within SQL Server. So you can do joins on it and treat it just like you would any table that is in SQL Server. So it's really not that complicated thing to do, but again, it provides quite a bit of rich functionality to be able to put your data in anywhere you need it to be in order for this to happen. All right. One thing that I wanted to show you as well is some getting started stuff for Hortonworks. So it's pretty easy to get started. Again, you can just download it. And once you have it downloaded, you can go ahead and start managing with Mbari, which is what this is. So notice I'm not looking at some like horrible, I don't know what it is, command box. I'm actually doing a GUI, which I think is maybe what people are much more used to doing. So you're not necessarily, down in the weeds of stuff. And these tutorials that they've got will really help you if you're trying to get up to speed. You'll see this is where I got the geolocation. So if you want to do exactly what I did here, if you go to the Hortonworks sandbox, you are able to duplicate everything that I did. I will also have this information on my blog, so with a step, so that you can just go ahead and do this yourself if you want to go ahead and do it. All right. So, little trick about Polybase, though. You saw that one of the things that I did was I created a table. Well, that means I have to know what and I showed you what the data looks like. If one thing that I've seen when people are starting to throw things in data lakes, and I do mean throw things in data lakes, they're forgetting where the underlying data is stored, and you'll need to know that because you'll need to put a table on top of whatever you have. Now, if you don't wish to include all the fields that you've got, you can do that. But you do have to be able to configure the data to be able to query it. Most data is structured in some way and somehow, but if you are going to work with data in SQL Server, it needs to be data that is similarly, formatted so that you can get data into SQL Server. So this is designed for structured data. I know that one of the things that you used to read about a lot with Hadoop is like, oh yeah, you can put anything in there. Well, yes, you can, but if you're going to query it within SQL Server, you're better off querying data that SQL Server is used to actually seeing. And oh, by the way, just because you have your table in SQL Server, it's not a real SQL Server table. It's HDFS, which means no updates. If you want to update the data, you're going to have to actually physically move the data to SQL Server and then modify it. You cannot modify data within the HDFS cluster from within SQL Server. All right, so this is one of the many tools that have been created to use existing SQL Server sets to use the data. As a matter of fact, Hive was originally created by Facebook. Facebook thought that it would be easier to leverage the skills of their staff who already knew SQL rather than to teach everybody how to use MapReduce. So this kind of logic is they would rather write an entire program than train people. But this kind of logic has been going on for a while, and more Hadoop integration is going towards SQL Server because SQL Server has been, SQL databases because the installed knowledge base is so high. But your underlying data determines what tool can be used. I mean, you can't use Hive if it's not formatted properly. But one of the things that's really neat about Polybase is it provides the ability to use Hadoop and SQL Server and not move it. So you don't have to make a decision, oh, what am I going to do? Am I going to use HDFS or am I going to use SQL Server? It doesn't matter. You can put it anywhere you want to and still be able to use it. All right, does anybody have any questions?
There definitely are some in the questions panel. If you want to pull that up, you can decide which ones are best to answer.
All right, I got to make it bigger so I can see it. Okay. SSA asked many to many, can you elaborate? This is kind of back to what I was talking about before, but with tabular, you now have the ability to create bridge tables so that you can create a many relationship within analysis services tabular. Where can I find out more information on R? Go to my website, Desert Isle SQL, because I've put in 5 links there with everything that you need to know to get started in R. I've got links for Revolution Analytics as well, Microsoft product, as well as the open source R, and a tutorial program called Swirl so that you can start teaching yourself how to use it. So you're sure you need to know exactly what data that you have, the correct data types, field lengths, etc. Yes, but you can fudge on the lengths. I mean, you can always go big. I mean, there's no reason that you have to exactly count it. You can make your field lengths ridiculously long so that you're sure that you won't have any truncation problems. Can you do data type conversions within the syntax of your create? You can only reflect the data that's there. So if you've got data that is stored that's numeric and has a couple of text fields values in it, it's going to be text. There's no conversion. And yes, I do understand it's if you've got huge amount of data, but it's basically reflecting the way that the data was stored into HDFS, because if you were doing the same thing, if you were querying the HDFS cluster in Hive, you'd have the same problem. So what language is Polybase using when it brings back data to SQL? It's using an implementation of Hive. Hive is the SQL-like query language. Spark is designed for streaming data. So it runs a process until there's no data left, or in perpetuity. MapReduce is basically writing a Java code that goes out to the clusters and grabs the data and comes back. So that's how the MapReduce work. In answer to the question, is Polybase available in SQL 2012 to 2014? No. You can only do this with SQL Server 2016, and it has not been released yet. Yes, this will be recorded and available probably sometime by tomorrow. Could I share the PowerPoint with us after this session? I will put a link to the slides on my blog, but it's going to be available as a recording as well. So how's the performance?
And also, Ginger, for those of you that are logged in and have the GoToWebinar panel, if you go to the handout section, her presentation is there as well.
Oh, how nice. How about data file partitioning using Polybase? Yeah, can't do that. That would be a really nice performance feature. How's the performance when you have really large files? Not so good, to be honest. You can't index this either. So if you're doing joins with it to standard, if you're doing joins to standard SQL tables, it can get kind of slow. If you are going to want to do a whole lot of high-performing queries, this isn't what you want to do. If you want to make sure that you can look at the data that's available, this will help you out, but is it speedy, quick? No. How is it different from Azure HD Insight? Azure HD Insight is a Hadoop implementation of HDFS in the cloud. So it's just another place where the data is stored. I'm sure you can query data from there as well. I think it would probably work better if you're also doing an Azure database. Is there any limit on size of data extraction with Polybase? Well, how much memory do you have on your machine? And how complicated are the queries that you want to do? Because, again, it's not the fastest thing in the world. Is a Polybase better fit for a data warehouse? Well, here's the deal with a data warehouse. A data warehouse is generally designed for giving information back to users in a relatively reasonable period of time. It's also, generally speaking, used as a bedrock for analysis services if you want to go with combining a lot of data. I think it's another tool that you could use. One thing that I think it is really good for is archiving off data. So the data is still available, yet you're not storing it from within SQL Server. Give you an example, I used to do some work with GPS information. And in the first 30 days, they wanted the application in the transactional system so that they could pull it up again and a little vehicle could be shown driving around the screen. Well, they got updates every 10 seconds, so it's quite a lot of data. There's no need to keep that data around forever unless in a year's time someone comes back and says, yeah, your truck caused a giant accident. Well, if you do that, you can archive the data off, but when you need it for your lawsuit, you could just pull it up within SQL Server and do any kind of ad hoc analysis you wanted to do. If you want to do ongoing performing analysis, it's probably best if you actually load the data up. But if you are going to want to do it for an occasional use, or you've got a whole lot of data that you need to do that kind of with, I think that's a better fit for Polybase. Is there any file compression built in the technology? No, there isn't, funny enough. Can we use this external table in OLAP? I think so, but I haven't tested it, so I can't say for sure. And can I download the R app for free? Yes. There are 2 R apps. One of them is open source R with R project. The other one is Microsoft R Studio, which is and if you download the free community version of the Visual Studio tools, you have the ability to use R within Visual Studio. You do not have to use Microsoft's version of R within Visual Studio. You can still use open source R to look at it, and either which way you decide to do it, it's not going to cost you any money either way. Can I say something about design patterns for joining large tables with SQL and Hadoop? I would try to do the best joins that you can and as minimal tables, because if you do that, your performance will be good. And if a lot of times people have things in Hadoop because they have a ton of data, so it gets to be kind of a problem. Can I compare the performance of Polybase for Hadoop versus a SQL Server of the same size? What I really noticed the difference in performance is when doing joins, because if you're just selecting the data, it does that pretty well. And if you've got huge HDFS tables, that's when you really start seeing some problems with performance. Can you create stored procs and functions against them? You can call these tables within stored procs. You cannot create functions on them. Are there any performance information available? You know what? I'm looking for some because I haven't played with this yet enough to know the real performance metrics around it. So I hope that Microsoft does it, but again, it's one of those giant it depends things because it depends, because where you have your HDFS clusters, how many clusters you have, what kind of a server it is, all that starts to matter. How does Polybase handle anomalies in the data? Very badly. If you have bad data, it won't load. And you'll get all these fun and wonderful errors telling you absolutely nothing that you can do anything with, which is kind of not very good. Is this optional install part of SQL Server 2016? Yes. As a matter of fact, if you do not select Polybase install when you're doing the installation of 2016, you won't get it. You'll have to go back and do it. In the implementation of Hive, each query is converted into a MapReduce job. underlying behind the scenes, but since it's an abstraction layer, I don't really think that that is a good analogy, because a MapReduce job is designed to singularly go after a certain set of data, whereas Hive was written to be more of a generic layer on top of it. If you join two big tables, and one of them is in HDFS, and another is in SQL Server, does Polybase pull data from HDFS to SQL Server or push data to SQL Server to Polybase? It's pulling, and it pulls into memory. It's not physically storing this data, so it's pulling the data into memory. So again, if you've got a ton of memory, it will help you out. It does that, and it caches some of it. What about calculation? Will this work with the HG Insight Hadoop cluster? I'm not sure. I assume that it should, but I don't know how to set that up to make that happen. Because if you looked at the configuration flags, none of them contained an ability to do that natively. So I was kind of wondering that myself, and I don't have the answer to that question. I'll see if I can find that out for you, though, because I'm also interested in knowing the answer there. What about calculations on large tables don't involve any joins? That's actually pretty quick. That's not a really big problem with it. Does it coexist in parallel with AG? I'm not sure what AG is, so I'm not sure that I can answer that question. So that's it for the questions that we had today. If anybody else has any other questions, if you can go ahead and ping me on Twitter or availability group. Okay, does it coexist in parallel with availability groups? Not really. I'm not exactly understanding what you're getting. But it doesn't coexist in parallel with availability groups, so it's kind of separate. Another thing too is that the security model on this, I think, is kind of light, so it's not exactly the most robust way of doing of accessing the data from a security perspective, because I think that's all kind of raw. So if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to hit me up on Twitter or drop me a line on my blog, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions that you have. And I plan on doing a follow-up with the information questions here and providing all the links so that you can go ahead and get started doing Polybase and Hadoop as well.
Great. Thanks, Ginger. As Ginger said, she'll be doing a follow-up blog, so if you're not already following us on Twitter, please make sure to do that, because we will be posting about it there. If for some reason you weren't able to get the presentation from the handout section, you can email me, Liz. It's the email that comes with all your GoToWebinar information. And as always, the recording will be available soon, and you'll receive an email tomorrow with the link. Thanks again, Ginger. Thanks, everybody.